Hey Reef Builders, what's going on? It's Evan Montgomery. I'm coming back at you from my place today. We're standing here in front of my 92-gallon mixed reef tank. This is not going to be as much of a tank tour video, so if you want more information on the system itself, the equipment that I use, maintenance procedures, and just a little bit more in-depth information on this tank, you can hop back on the YouTube channel about 6 months ago. I believe it was in April of this year. We did like a half-hour video, a full tour of the system, and honestly not a whole lot has changed since then as far as the equipment that I use and maintenance procedures and stuff like that we talked about in that video. So if you want more in-depth information about the system itself, you can hop back to that video. But today, you know, I was kind of just looking at my tank and thinking about the corals I've got, and what I really like about this system is I've got some good classic corals. I think they kind of outnumber the new school corals, if you want to call them that, you know. Going to shows and reef shows these days, there's so many like hype name corals, fancy acros, all kinds of bounce mushrooms, you name it, you know, but those I feel like are a little bit newer to the reefing scene in this hobby. But there's a handful of corals that have been in the hobby, some of them since the 80s, and that's what's kind of cool about those to me is that, you know, they've been in captivity for so long, pretty much just the same strain, keep going and going through different people's tanks. And I think I have a pretty good collection of the classic corals here today, and I kind of want to just take a minute to point those out because so much of the focus these days is on the new hype corals, and I think a tank with some of the old classics, you know, they're classics for a reason. They're great corals, people love them, and you know, just great colors and all that stuff. So let's take a look here at some of my favorites in my home tank. So one of the first things people notice when they walk up to the tank, and definitely one of the big show pieces that I have, are the two red and green Montipora Capricornises here. This red one here is just a classic. I think that's the original strain that pretty much everybody's had at some point in their reefing career. It's just a gorgeous coral. I love the way it grows, although it is a little, it grows a little fast. You can see in the front there is some tissue damage from the algae magnet hitting it. Back, I think in April, I fragged that back down to just a little chunk on the rock, and so that's not much more than 6 months worth of growth right there. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. You know, if you can keep up with your alkalinity demands and grow a coral like this, I think it's well worth having in just about any tank. And occasionally a small piece will break off, and if we come around the corner here, I just kind of glued it onto the back of the rock and it's already quadrupled in size about. So that's a great coral, especially for people getting into the hobby, beginners. The red Monty Cap is easy to find, and I think most people are going to love it. And right next to it, I've got the Langsai Cap, which I believe is the same species. It's just a totally different strain. Obviously, quite different color. My Blenny likes to hang out on the scrolls there. Similar to the red Monty Cap, it grows super fast. You can kind of see it encroaching up on some of my acros I've got in here, and it grows fast enough to where I actually sometimes will just take a frag disc with some other corals and just place them right in the middle there and kind of use the acro, or use the Monty as a shelf. But the nice purple rim on this coral is hard to beat. The contrast between the green and the blue there is just something that really makes the tank pop. Just having nice contrast there. Nice bumpy texture to it, a very fascinating coral to look at and take macro pictures of. It's hard to beat that one. As long as we were talking about the Montiporas, let's hop over to this one. Another classic coral, been in the hobby for a really long time. This is the Mantipura Hispada. I got this as just a little encrusting on a frag plug couple years, 2-3 years ago maybe, and it has just taken off. It's never slowed down since the day I put it in here. I really like this one because it does all kind of 3 growth forms. It'll encrust on the rock, it'll plate out, and it'll also throw out some branches once it gets large enough. I didn't realize the potential of this coral when I first got it. You know, it was, like I said, just a little bit of encrusted coral on a frag plug. But once this thing started to grow, I realized why people have had this coral in the hobby for so long, because it is just a stunner. The contrast between the brownish base and the bright green polyps, combined with the way that it grows, just really makes that one, I understand why it's a classic. So as long as we're still talking about Montiporas, let's hop up to the red Mantipura Digita here. Just like the other ones I've got, they're pretty much all Monties. It does grow quite fast as well. It's pretty much taken over the entire center back of my reef tank there. The skeleton is so brittle that even just like when my yellow tang swims by and hits a branch, it'll often self-frag. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but if that didn't happen, it might very well be grown up to the surface of the tank already. I understand why this one's a classic. You know, the growth pattern, the ends of the branches have a really cool shape to them, and the polyps themselves kind of go with the flow and show off a little bit more motion than some of the other Montiporas do. Also another great one for beginners. You know, it's hard to slow that one down once it gets happy, and I think that's just a showpiece coral that I think most people should try at some point. Pretty noticeable here when we're looking at the red Monty is actually another classic coral. There's a good assortment or a good little field of green star polyps kind of growing in and amongst its base. You know, at first I thought that that might be an issue and I was going to take the whole thing out and scrape off all the star polyps, but they've kind of just managed to stay in that one little spot and really add some nice motion to that that corner of the tank back there. You know, there's a lot of different strains of green star polyps. Some of them look different than this for sure. I'm not exactly sure what the name of this strain is or anything like that, but I've personally had it for going on almost 10 years now, and it's just always been somewhere in my tank. I can't quite bring myself to get rid of that classic. Another fast growing coral that's been in the hobby for a really long time is the serie strix, the bird's nest coral. Again, there's different varieties of this floating around. You know, there's like the bird of paradise and some stuff like that, but I think the one I've got here is pretty much the OG, you know, been around the block in the hobby for quite a few years. Also grows really fast. These things tend to grow really fast, grow really big, and then die really fast, but there's usually at least a couple tips left that you can snip off and start the colony over again. I think this colony is probably at least the third iteration that I've had in that cycle. It really offers a nice contrast between all the encrusting and plating corals around it to have something with those sharp tips to it, and just a really different growth form than a lot of the other corals in my tank, and I appreciate that one a lot. You know, I almost can't imagine a reef tank without the sprung stunner echinopora. This is another classic that's been around for a really long time, and you can totally see why. You know, it grows in a really interesting way. I've had some in different locations in the tank that grew out more like a plating Monty, but this one here seems to be bunched up. It almost looks like a pavona or something, the way that the ends of the coral are growing there, but you know, it does throw out some sweepers at night. I'm kind of worried about my green anacropora over here getting into a fight with it one of these days, but knock on wood, so far so good. Man, you know, I've only had this particular coral here for about 2.5 years, I think, about, and when I got it, it was about the size of a nickel. It was just a little small chunk that I glued onto the side of the overflow box, hoping it would like that spot, and clearly it does. This is just a great coral. The contrast between the green polyps and the dark blue kind of milky colored base is just a really nice addition to any reef tank. And I think, you know, even though it does throw out some sweepers, there's always a spot for it where you can kind of tuck it up out of the way, and if you keep it trimmed back, you don't have too much to worry about there. Highly recommend this one also for beginners. You know, it grows really fast. It's kind of hard to kill. Once it gets going and finds a happy place, it just is a stunner, like the name implies. Some people think I'm totally crazy for putting the Red Sea pulsing xenia in my tank, but kind of like some of the other classics we've talked about here, you know, a reef tank almost isn't complete without some xenia in there somewhere. Another great coral for beginners. Obviously it grows out pretty fast. It's pretty much engulfed the entire back wall of my tank here. It's up out of the way. It's not encroaching over the other corals too badly. Occasionally a spot will pop up here or there in the tank, and I'll just scrape that off with like a dental tool before it gets out of control and starts smothering things. But I think with the rate that this grows too, it's got to be a pretty good source of or means of nutrient removal from the tank. I know I can't keep my nitrates or phosphate up, and there's probably a few reasons for that, but I think this pulsing xenia helps quite a bit in that. It's also one of the best corals when you do turn off your flow and look top down in the tank. You see all the pulsing action on the polyps. It just seems so much more alive than a lot of the other corals in that way. And you know, a lot of people actually are kind of shocked when they see the tank with the flow off and realize how much this coral actually moves. That's one that, you know, friends will come over and not really know much about corals. And with this one, it really hits home that these are animals. They grow and do all the things animals do. So I think that's a great one if you have a little extra space in your tank for something to maybe get a little bit out of control. I can't imagine life without it. This might be one of the oldest strains of almost any coral that we've had in captivity. Obviously the milka stylo has been featured here from my tank a few times. We cut it back down from the surface, I guess about 6 months ago. I think that was about April. And you can see already that it's made it about halfway there again. I recently got a school, or a small school, I think 4 or 5 little chromis, and they like to hang out in the branches in there, and that's really made me look at this coral in a different way. It's more of like an ecosystem of its own. It's like a habitat for some fish to go and hide out in there. It's another fast grower, and it's more difficult to remove because the skeleton is quite dense. It's easy for me to see with this coral as well why people have kept it around for so long, and once it was in people's tanks it was hard to let go of. You know, the bright blue fuzzy looking base with the polyps that go in the flow contrasts really well with the bright white growth tips, and once it gets going, it's the colony turns into something special. You know, a small little frag of this might not look like very much, but once it turns into a full-blown colony, you can really appreciate the potential in this coral. Again, that bright blue purple is just it's hard to beat that, and it contrasts really well with a lot of other things in the tank. So this is obviously just a small sampling of what could be considered classic corals. I think there's actually more in the hobby than people realize that have been around for so long. You know, like I said earlier, the focus these days, it seems like it's really been on like the new stuff coming in from the wild, or new strains that have been developed, and grafted corals and all this fancy stuff. But those can sometimes set you back quite a bit of money, and people overlook the old classics, which you can usually get for a pretty fair price, you know, especially in the case of like the pulsing xenia. You know, people are just giving that away out of their tanks at a certain point. So especially for beginners in the hobby, you know, that's a good route to go instead of buying this fancy coral that might just end up dying on you. And not to mention, you know, a lot of the new corals look great when they're a tiny little frag, but they grow out into a colony and they kind of lose a lot of that magic. You know, some of these classics like the Monties and the bird's nest, they really get better as they grow. You know, you see them as a small frag and maybe they're not that exciting, but as time goes on and they do well in your tank, you can really see the potential that these corals can have. So hopefully you've enjoyed this little peek into my home tank here, looking at some of my favorite corals, some of my favorite classic corals. And you know, if you did enjoy this video, go ahead and hit the like button on YouTube, subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit that notification bell so you get notified whenever we produce a new one, and go ahead and share it with your friends too, you know, spread the love a little bit. And until next time, this has been Evan Montgomery, and I'll catch you real soon.